Thank you, Rabbi Eli. I'm very pleased to welcome everybody to the second in our series of History for the Curious, and I'm welcoming participants here this evening on behalf of one of the four sponsoring shuls. I'm representing Central Square Minyan, and the other three sponsoring shuls are the Bet Hamidrash Hagadol of Leeds, Bronsbury Park United Synagogue, and Southampton Synagogue. And we're really pleased to be delving deeper into history for the curious. And unlike last week, where the subject of the session was Maimonides, of whom many of us had heard, I'm sure that very few of us know anything much about Dona Gracia. From the introductory material, we know that she was an extraordinary woman who dined with kings, ran a shipping empire, and saved the lives of hundreds. So I am certainly curious to know as much as we can learn in an hour. Over to you, Rabbi Hurd.
So by way of introduction, the 16th century produced quite a number of powerful and wealthy women, amongst whom we include somebody from these shores, Elizabeth I, who was queen for 45 years from 1558. There was Catherine de' Medici, originally Italian, who was both the wife of a king and the mother of another French king. Yet, in comparison, Dona Gracia stands head and shoulders above them. She was widowed at the age of 26 and forced for many years to live a double life. Outwardly, she was Catholic and at home inwardly to the extent that was possible initially, and then to a far larger extent later on, she lived as a Jewess. As mentioned in the introduction, she dined with the most powerful rulers of Europe, including Queen Maria of Habsburg, Maximilian II, and the Sultan of Turkey. She ran a financial empire and clandestinely provided sanctuary for hundreds, potentially even thousands of converso Marrano Jews. She faced imprisonment and in fact at one stage was imprisoned in 1548. And of course, because she was officially a Christian, she faced potentially the death penalty. Yet she managed to thwart the powerful Inquisition. Fittingly, for somebody who lived for so many years a double life, she had two names, Beatrice de Luna, Mendes is the surname. Beatrice de Luna was the name she was known by in Portugal, and Gracia and Beatrice obviously have a common affiliation in terms of blessing, was the name that she preferred to go by. Now, I'm going to share screen for the moment, and let's have a look at, it's jumping ahead of ourselves over there. Let's put this back in and get all the way to the top. Here we have a coin or a medal, really, that was produced in 2010, 500 years after the birth of Dona Gracia in 1510. And on that coin, which was produced in Israel, we have the beginnings of a very famous verse from the Zemirot of Friday night, Rabot Banot Asu Chayil. Many women have performed deeds of valor. V'chana Nasi, Gracia, her Hebrew name was Chana, Alta al Kulana. She was greater than any of these women. And you have in the center various things that we will speak about, the Tanakh, the Ferrara Tanakh. You have a ship there with two letters on the sails. One is A and one is P. And on the left-hand side, you have the walls of Tiberius of Tiberia for reasons that will hopefully become apparent. Now, by way of understanding the life and the environment into which she was born in 1510, we need to deal initially with Spain briefly, and then move to Portugal. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, in 1492, Jewish life ceased in Spain. At that stage, the Jews were given the stark choice between conversion or exile, and hundreds of thousands of Jews, in fact, chose exile. Equally, at least 100,000 probably chose conversion to Catholicism, hoping that this would be only a brief stay, a brief obstruction, but in actual fact, until the first decade of the 19th century, meaning for over 300 years, the Inquisition, the Holy See, existed in Spain and subsequently in Portugal as well. Having said that, even though we know of the date of 1492, really the death knell for Spanish Jewry was sounded a century earlier in 1391. There were pogroms all over the country. At least 50,000 Jews were murdered and tens of thousands converted at that stage. And from then on, there was increased pressure on the Jews. However, and this is important to understand, the Inquisition was not aimed at the Jews. I mean, of course, it was aimed at Jews, but not the Jews, by which I mean as follows. The Inquisition's purpose was to ensure that there were no backsliding Christians. And therefore, the people who were most viewed and targeted were these new Christians, all these Jews who had converted to Christianity and were suspected of sliding back into their ways of error of old as Jews. So that if you were actually Jewish and living in Spain in the 1400s, you could live unmolested by the Inquisition. But if you had converted at that stage, you would be the focus of the attention of the Inquisition. Which is why in 1492, when Jews were given that stark final choice on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av of 1492, about 150,000 made their way west from Spain to Portugal, where life was similar in many ways, and therefore they felt they would continue to live lives openly as Jews. Unfortunately, the honeymoon was very brief. Within 4 years, Portugal had joined Spain in its threat to Judaism, to Jewish religious life. And they gave the Jews those same two choices. This was brought about by the king wanting to marry the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And this girl was not prepared to marry a king who ran a country in which Jews still lived. And therefore the Jews were given this stark choice. Now, if we have a look at this map here of Sir Martin Gilbert, you will see that without going into all the writing and the details, you can see potentially, if I get to viewing full page width, you will be able to see along the lines at the bottom here, when the 1492 expulsion took place, that 100,000 go to Turkey, 25,000 to Holland, we'll come to that in a moment, and many initially, as I said, went to Portugal, but then they are all included in this same issue, in this same problem. And by 1497, Portugal was no better than Spain. So Jews started looking for other avenues of escape, for other places to go where they could live as Jews. Interestingly enough, one of those places was South America. Southern and Latin America had been discovered, so to speak, by mainly the Portuguese and the Spanish. And in order to run the administration of these new countries, and in order to deal with the maritime challenges of basically stealing everything that they came across and shipping it back to Europe, they needed a mercantile class, and they needed people who were somewhat learned, somewhat able to read and write, and therefore they allowed the Jews to come to South America and closed their eyes for 1 century. This was the deal almost at the beginning. They would close their eyes for 1 century as to how the Jews lived at home. And therefore, indeed, many Jews took that opportunity, but the Inquisition was true to its word, and at the end of the 1500s, it came to South and Latin America, and therefore Jews were burnt at the stake in Brazil and in Mexico for the crime of living as Jews. In the photo beneath this one, for those of you who have visited Lisbon, this might be a site that you are aware of. This, as you can see, gives on to the Atlantic. This is the square in full view of the public of Lisbon. This is where inquisitions would take place for those Jews who were unfortunate enough to be caught by the Inquisition, which was not particularly difficult, it must be said, given that anybody who informed successfully, quote unquote, on Jews received 50% of their possessions. And therefore, it was in the interest of the informant to find Jews. You can imagine, therefore, the fear and the terror that Jews lived under if they were to practice any form of Judaism. And as I mentioned, the Inquisition went on for over 3 centuries. Now, if we carry on down the page, you will see here Jews living in Latin and South America. You can see here a secret Jew taken back to Spain to face the Inquisition. But in all of these places, you have, unfortunately, the long arm of the Inquisition. One other place that Jews escaped to was Holland. If you've ever been to the cemetery in Ouderkerk, southern Amsterdam, you will see very interestingly created, ornate almost, tombstones. There is a close-up you can see in this bottom photo of what you're looking at in the photo above, not something you would expect to find on a Jewish tombstone. Skull and crossbones, cherubs, the Grim Reaper, etc. But the reason for that was that Amsterdam's Jews were entirely of conversos origin. They were entirely made up of Jews who'd been living lives as Catholics and suddenly were given religious freedom in Holland in the 1570s, and they knew almost nothing about Judaism. There was no access to literature and no open observance of Jews, not only from them, but their parents, their grandparents. By now, the Inquisition was a century old, and therefore they had been influenced by the calligraphy and by the art of Catholicism. And this is what they brought to their own cemetery. In this cemetery was established at the very beginning of the 17th century. And these are Jews who have escaped the Inquisition in the Iberian Peninsula. If we now therefore come back to Dona Gracia herself. She, as I mentioned, was born in 1510. She comes from a family who fled Spain. Many of the members of their family lost their lives in Spain to the Inquisition, and they initially settle in Portugal, but this is a temporary destination. They want to leave. There's one problem. As soon as the Inquisition is adequately established, which would take 20 years, the Inquisition starts in 1497 in Portugal. Within 20 years, it is adequately established. By this time, they don't allow new Christians to leave town, especially not en famille, right? They're not going to allow them to leave if they are accompanied by family members. They are essentially hostages to make sure that they stay where they are, or that they return to where they are supposed to be. And the interesting thing about the Jews living in Portugal is that a number of them, having now converted forcibly or otherwise to Christianity, had all doors opened for them, meaning they could enter into any trade. The Christians the church wanted to welcome them with open arms in order to make sure that these new Christians understood the value and the benefits of being Christian. So they could do whatever they wanted. In fact, a number of conversos Jews became bishops. But this is especially the case when it came to trade. So that you had these new Christians who became wealthy over a period of time and who established trade routes, let's say, from Portugal to the Americas, to Amsterdam, bearing in mind that Vasco da Gama had created a new route to India not that much earlier, around the Cape, and therefore there was an alternate way of doing trade with the Far East, so that there were real financial opportunities available. Now, Gracia marries when she's 18 years old. She marries in 1528 a fellow new Christian. The Jews who had converted practiced for many years, potentially centuries, what we would call endogamy, which means they only married amongst their own. Even though, as I mentioned, most Jewish practice was forbidden to them, but nevertheless, they held on at least to marrying within their own. And he belonged to a banking empire, and between the two families, shipping and banking came together. They wanted to leave. They started laying plans for their departure and for liquidating assets and possibly turning it into portable wealth, when in 1536, she is now 26 years old, her husband dies, she has one young daughter, and she is left to cope on her own. So not only is she now required to maintain this identity as a Jewess in an entirely strongly Catholic country, but she also needs to navigate the world of finance. She had a brother-in-law, a brother of her husband, living in Antwerp. Antwerp was a port that was also under Spanish Catholic rule. It was part of the Holy Roman Empire, and therefore it was not off limits. So what she does is she moves with her daughter and her younger sister, Brianda. They move to Antwerp, and eventually, in fact, her younger sister will marry her brother-in-law. So it ended up that two sisters married two brothers, although in his case, he also tragically died quite young. He died in 1542. Now, while they were in Antwerp, despite the fact that it is nominally under Catholic rule, it is, in the same way as we mentioned about the Rambam living in Spain, which is far away from headquarters in the Middle East, this too is further away from the fanatic headquarters of Spain and Portugal. And it's interesting that, you know, the comparison and contrast with last week. In both cases, you have figures in Jewish history who are presented with living in countries where they are forced to make decisions by the fanaticism of the religious figures who are controlling the country in which they live. Now, being that she was slightly further away, she was able to observe Shabbat and the festivals in her home, although, of course, she is attending Mass, she is going to church every Sunday, because being Catholic and being a religious Catholic were one and the same thing in those days. And you couldn't be Catholic and not turn up to church. So she's doing everything that she should in order to give the impression that she is a Catholic, but in reality, she's living as much as she can as a Jewess. And being that this hasn't been that long since Portugal has been forcibly converted, she has already been brought up at home by parents who lived fully Jewish lives. As I say, when you contrast this with the picture we have on screen, the Jews in Holland, 100 years later, 3 generations had passed by, they knew nothing, but she knew a lot. To give an understanding of their financial status, where they were at and how they were able to make a name for themselves, in 1532, her brother-in-law had been arrested by an informant who said that her brother-in-law in Antwerp was actually practicing Judaism, and the person who got him out of jail was Henry VIII. Now, it's true, Henry VIII was a Protestant and had no love lost for the Catholics, but nevertheless, he is a reigning monarch at the time, but is prepared to testify about somebody who, at least he can suspect, was Jewish, but nevertheless remains faithful to Diogo Mendes, and he is released from jail. Now, on the map in front of you, you have her travels. As you can see in the top right-hand corner, it is entitled The Journeys of the House of Nasi. They go from Lisbon. They will actually briefly stop off in London, even though it is the accepted wisdom that there were, in fact, no Jews living in England after the expulsion in 1290. Until the 1650s, this is actually incorrect. There were Jews living there, there just weren't open Jews living there. There was a small community, especially in Elizabethan times, which is slightly after this. There was a community in Bristol and a community in London. Conversos, once again, openly Catholic and hidden Jews. There's a whole list, a whole register of these names. So she briefly docks in London and from there goes to Antwerp. She will travel, and I'll mention the map and then we'll go into the details. She will travel south to Lyon and then east to Venice. Although you can see Ferrara highlighted there, the dot slightly above it is Venice, which is where she will end up. Let's, for the moment though, return to her life in Antwerp. While she is there, she will set up a network for escaping conversos, for escaping Marrano Jews, using captains that she trusts within the fleet of ships that she has at her disposal, and using informants all over Europe. She will either smuggle them on board or tell them which cities are safer to flee to. For instance, in the south of France, even though by that time Provence no longer existed as an independent entity, it had been swallowed up into the French king's rule, but there were still papal states. Avignon and Cavaillon and Carpentras and Nîmes were under papal rule. And however ironic this sounds, it was easier at certain times to live under the Pope than to live in Spain or Portugal. So she would organize a a bricha network, the equivalent of which the Jewish people only encounter after the Second World War, where Jews are smuggled into what was at the time Palestine, into Eretz Yisrael. In doing so, she elicits the help of Jews and non-Jews alike, including Daniel Bomberg, who was the printer of the first entire set of Talmud. It was not the printer of the first volume of Talmud, that was Sonsino, but he was the first one to print an entire set. He was non-Jewish, he was living in Venice, and he was one of the people that she used. As you can imagine, he was a Judeophile, and she made use of this and of the fact that he was in a different city and could provide her with information. Now, after her brother-in-law dies, she now has to fend for herself and her daughter and her sister. And when I say fend, I don't mean financially. They were well provisioned at the time, but they had unwarranted and unwanted attention as suitable mates. These were people of wealth, and therefore there were a number of shadchanim who got involved in trying to marry them off. Now, if the shadchanim would have been Jewish and trying to marry them off to Jews, that would have been one thing. But because her company was royalty, the type of suggestions that came their way were the nobility of Catholic families across Europe. And at one stage, the Queen Regent, the sister of Charles V, came up with the perfect marriage partner for Brianda, for the younger sister of Gracia Mendez, and that was a particular nobleman who lived in Spain. Now, to turn down the offer out of hand would have invited inquiry as to why an eligible young woman wouldn't want to marry somebody of noble lineage. And therefore, it became extremely uncomfortable to continue living in Antwerp. She needed to leave town, she needed to take her sister and her daughter with her. Where to? Where is she going to go, and how is she going to go? So once again, she has to liquidate whatever assets she is able. All land that she owns, she leaves behind, and she flees south. Officially, she's going to Aix-la-Chapelle to take the waters. This is in late 1544. But suddenly, it is found that she has left France altogether. Her house in Antwerp one day is empty. Her retinue travel through France and end up in Venice. And the French king, Henry II, makes a play to get hold of her assets, but to no avail. She is beyond his reach. She is now living in Italy, still living openly as a Catholic and only surreptitiously as a Jew, but once again, able to live pretty much the type of life that she had lived in Antwerp. So to observe many of the festivals and many or some of the laws. However, tragedy had not finished with her yet. Her younger sister had taken a liking to the good life as a Christian. This had been the case even in Antwerp, to the extent that when her brother-in-law died, he left the rights over his financial affairs not to his widow, but to his sister-in-law, his older sister-in-law, Gracia Mendez. He didn't give them to Brianda because he didn't trust her. He wanted to make sure that she would not just spend the money partying with nobility, And also, potentially, although we don't have records of this, because he was unsure of how strong her connection and affiliation to Judaism was. And indeed, it was tenuous. And when she asked her older sister for her share of the inheritance of the wealth, her older sister was reluctant to give it to her. And therefore, the younger sister, in 1548, informed the Christian authorities that her older sister was, in fact, secretly a Jewess. And even though you could tolerate a Jew in private, but not once an official complaint had been made. And Gracia Mendez was arrested in Venice, and her daughter Reina was placed in a convent. However, at this stage, the Jewish connections that she had forged while in Venice, the Venetian Republic, was a powerful trading state. Unfortunately, Venice in the 20th and 21st century still sees itself as the Venetian Republic by the price they charge you to stay in their hotels. But in the days of old, if you go back 500 years, indeed, they were a powerful, I don't know quite an empire, but a powerful region. And they traded with Turkey across the Adriatic. In Turkey, Moshe Hamon, a Jew, was the physician to the Sultan. And the Ottoman Empire was coming into its own at this time. You will know, no doubt, that the walls around the city, around the old city in Jerusalem, were constructed in the 16th century, in the 1500s, by the Ottomans, who spread over the entire Middle East. And therefore, the Turkish Sultan was a force to be reckoned with. And he weighed in on this debate about Dona Gracia and had her released from jail. When she was released, by now it was 1550, she journeyed to one of my favorite cities in Europe, Ferrara, which is the city that you can see on the map here. I'm now going to move on from this map, so take your last look at the map for the moment, because she journeys now from Venice to Ferrara, which was under the Este, the Duke of Este's rule, and would remain so until the 1620s. And she will live in, I think we'll change the view back to one page, or maybe to 100%. Yes, there we are. She will live in this house in Ferrara. My last group that I took before lockdown was to this region of Italy. In fact, we got back just before lockdown. Happy to say that no one was affected by it. But you can actually see her house. And while there, let me see if I can get hold of, yep, this is the inside of the house. So here you have the entrance, here you have the inside, the courtyard of the house in which she lived in Ferrara. Here you have the castle, which still exists to this day. It still has a moat filled with water, which you can walk through. It's an undiscovered gem in Europe, both from a Jewish perspective and from a general perspective. And here you have above it, I believe that's the order I put this thing. Yes. Here you have the synagogue, which dates back, it's been renovated, but it dates back to the late 1400s. It was a synagogue, a building which contained two types of services. It had an Ashkenazi minyan and an Italian minyan, which is quite common for northern Italy. Those of you who've been to Venice will know that there are a number of shuls there. There's the Spanish shul, there's the Turkish shul, there's the Italian shul, there's the Provençal shul, there's the Ashkenazi shul, all of these communities living side by side. And here you have actually a photo of the Ashkenazi shul in this building. So she was able to live much more openly in Ferrara as a Jewess. And whilst there, she financed the production of this book, a Bible in Ladino. Two copies are, in fact, there are three copies extant. One is in the British Library in London, and it was the copy was made out to her for being such a great benefactor. And what you notice for this, I'm going to go back to viewing page width. You see here the image that she had inscribed on the book was of a ship at sea with, in the middle, a broken mast being tossed about. You can see slightly higher, if I can get this picture to move slightly. I don't know why the cursor keeps on disappearing on me, but you can see the wind blowing in the top right-hand corner. And this is how she saw the Jewish people at the time, at the mercy of forces which were very strong, suffering, having a broken mast, but still still being able to sail the seas and still being there to tell the tale. So all of this is really a description of her own personal life and of how she saw the fate of the Jews in Europe at the time. This Bible was produced in 1553 in Ladino for those Jews who had escaped from Spain and Portugal and now had a Sefer of their own. Until now, they had been relying on the Christian copies of the Old and the New Testament. It's interesting as to how they translate the word Alma. Famously in Isaiah, if you've ever been visited by missionaries who will talk about the virgin birth, even though the word Alma does not mean a virgin, it means a maiden. Betula would be a virgin. So it is in different copies. As I said, there are three copies that are around. In different copies, it's translated differently. Once it's just translated as Alma, and once as maiden, but there does not seem to be a copy where it's translated as virgin, which is quite interesting. Either way, she will remain in Ferrara for a number of years, but in 1556, she will leave to Turkey. And that's where she will spend the remaining years of her life. And in Turkey, she will openly espouse Judaism. Her daughter will marry her nephew. So Brianna had a son who marries his first cousin, and they will, between them, not only adopt an openly Jewish life, but their home will be a home that is open for all. Cecil Roth writes of the fact that 80 people a day dined in their house. And both her and her son-in-law and daughter became tremendous benefactors of Jewish activities. Firstly, to help people to come to Turkey, Jews, escaping Jews. She never abandoned that element of her charitable pursuits, but also hospitals. Mainly, though, she financed education, both by the printing of Jewish books, especially in Salonika, and also by the support of yeshivot. The Lisbon synagogue in Salonika, which she had constructed, had a yeshiva that was entirely paid for through her sponsorship. She also became friendly, so to speak, with some of the greatest Jewish sages of the day, most especially Rabbi Joseph Caro, the author of the Code of Jewish Law, who himself had been born in Spain in 1488. Obviously, at the age of 4, he had to leave Spain and he traveled through Greece and Turkey, eventually settling in Tzfat, in Safed, in Israel, and dying there in 1575. So at this period in his life, he was already in Tzfat, and she was in correspondence with him, and also she donated to causes in Israel, which was very nascent. The whole Jewish community there was in its infancy. It really started up again in the 1500s, although we mentioned the fact that the Rambam visited and the Ramban Nachmanides was there a century later, but there was numerically, it was a very small community, and it really only changes in the 1500s. Now, she has not yet given up on fighting for Jews. She might be supporting them charitably, but she is a woman of valor. She is a woman of action, and she will leave no stone unturned in the defense of Jews, wherever they may be, if she feels she is able to help them. An unbelievable individual. They should make a film about her, except that in order to do it justice, it would become unbelievable in the eyes of too many, and they would write it off as fiction, although it is actually fact. The scene of her next skirmish is the port of Ancona in Italy. She is by then living in Turkey. Ancona was part of a state that was not under the rule of the Pope, because by now, having said that earlier the papal states offered somewhat of a haven, that was true in the 1540s. By the time we come to the 1550s, the papal states are notorious for their discrimination against the Jews under the papacy of Paul IV. It was he in 1553 on Rosh Hashanah who would burn all copies of the Talmud in Rome and in Venice and in Padua. It was he on Tisha B'Av of 1554 who would incarcerate all the Jews of Rome into a ghetto. And it was he in 1556 in Ancona who demanded that Jews who had been accused of living as Jews should be handed over to the Inquisition. This was unfortunately done. 25 Jews were tortured and subsequently executed, and a further 30 were taken as slaves. Having escaped the Inquisition, Dona Gracia was horrified. She got the Sultan of Turkey to write to the Pope demanding the release of these 30 Jews, and threatened to retaliate financially if this was not done, remembering that she was a woman of means and had once again built up an empire in Turkey. Eventually, those Jews who had links to the Ottoman Empire, either they were business agents for them, or they could be said to have had some form of Turkish citizenship, were released. But the remaining group of Jews were kept as slaves. So she moves up a gear and she declares a boycott of Ancona. She gets together various merchants and various rabbonim, various rabbis, to sign a boycott, including the Shulchan Aruch, including the Rabbi Yosef Karo himself. This is the first time in over 1,000 years that Jews would use their economic power to create a boycott. They virtually never had the ability before then, and even afterwards, right until the 20th century, we don't hear of Jewish sanctioned and run economic boycotts, but this is what this woman on her own, brings against Ancona. And initially she is supported in this. Eventually the boycott will fall apart, because even amongst the Jews, there are Jews in Greece and in Turkey who feel that there will be retaliatory measures which will be stronger than, in other words, she will lose more than she gains, and the boycott will collapse. She hasn't finished yet. She moves her attention to a different field of endeavor, and that is to properly build a Jewish city in the land of Israel. And she chooses Tiberias, Tiberia, because it is essentially an abandoned piece of land. No one really wants it. So she promises the Sultan 1,000 gold ducats if he, in 1558, will lease her the rights to the city of Tiberias. And she says within 10 years, the amount that she will pay will increase tenfold. She puts ships at the disposal of Jews who want to make Aliyah. She starts building houses there. She herself was already of an age or of a disposition where she was not able to make the trip herself, but she encourages a community to be built in Tiberia. Unfortunately, once the Christians and the Arabs living in the area see this place being built up, not just the houses, but they imported silkworms, they planted groves, fruit groves, orchards. Once they saw that this place was becoming financial, they became jealous of the success, and they started, some of them, by attempting to attack this early community, and others by seeking to undermine their presence by claiming that they are disloyal to the Sultan and that they are now living independently and will soon proclaim their own independence in the country. Unfortunately, therefore, once again, this scheme collapsed, and there is almost nothing left that you can see of her endeavors. There are a few parts of wall there, although interestingly, there is a Dona Gracia hotel in Tiberias, which has one room given over to an exhibition of her and of sort of the costumes that she would have worn, etc., etc. I doubt anyone here has ever heard of it, never mind visited it, but it does exist. And there are markers. So if we go further down the page, this firstly is a medal that was created during their lifetime of Gracia Nasi the Younger, in other words, her daughter, where you can see the name in Hebrew along the left-hand side. Here you have a lookout post in Tiberias, Mitzpe Dona Gracia, also 500 years after she was born. And in the legend underneath, we will open the page up slightly. I see we are at full page width, okay. So you can see here that it talks about her contribution to the Jewish people. And in fact, there was a stamp issued in Israel in 1992 for Dona Gracia. Now, two last things, and then if there are any questions, I will take them. If we go back to what we started with, the coin at the very top. So we can now understand the walls on the left-hand side. They are the walls of Tiberia, and the trees that they planted there in order to build up the community. The two letters on the sails of the ship, A is Antwerp, which is where she, would sail to at the first opportunity, and P is Portugal, from where she hailed initially. In the middle, you have the picture of the Tanakh, the Ferrara Tanakh that she created. And really, it is difficult to adequately praise this woman for what she achieved. She could have lived a fairy tale existence, surrounded by the princes of Europe, but instead she opted for a much more difficult, a much more dangerous life, living for the truth. And she saved the lives of many, provided for many, and is a real testimony to Jewish faith, to Jewish perseverance in an age where she was living a life where at any moment she could have been informed upon. One last thing to close with. Her husband, who had died in 1528 in Portugal, was obviously buried in a Catholic cemetery. There were no other kind in Portugal. Somehow, we don't know how, but in 1554, she arranged for the transfer of the grave of her husband, and he was buried in the valley of Jehoshaphat in the land of Israel. Tragically, ironically, having done so much, when she dies in 1558, we do not know where she is buried. We do not have a grave, and therefore there is very little that actually marks her life that has endured. As I say, there are a few remnants of the wall in Tiberias, but that is virtually it, alongside books, Jewish books, Sfarim, that she printed or financed, which have thanks given to her in the opening pages, but little remains in the more durable sense of the word, aside from this building in Ferrara with the courtyard where she lived for a number of years in quasi-freedom. So I hope I have done her justice, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Please stop that. Please. Please.
My Hirsch, thank you. Totally tremendous, as always. The insight and inspiration. Thank you. Any questions? Anybody?
Yeah.
Yes. Can I speak? Hello. Yeah. Just to say that we have been to Dona Gracia house in Tiberia. It was absolutely fantastic, and they had a separate room there with costumes that they would have worn, as you said, and we were encouraged to dress up in them, which we did, and we had our photographs taken.
Rabbi, why do you like Ferrara so much? What's so special about it for you? Can't hear you, you're on mute.
So Ferrara, first of all, is very pretty. It's on the River Po. It's a beautiful place. Jewishly, it has a very rich history. Most of the ghetto still stands. You can even see the place on the wall of the Via Mancini where the ghetto gates once stood. And just within the area generally, there is a lot of history to discover. Padua is quite nearby, Bologna, all of these places have so much Jewish and general history. The Borgias were in Ferrara. There's just a lot, and nearby, because it's Ferrara, is the Ferrari factory. So you can even take a spin there, but it's pretty and there's a lot to it.
Her house is stunning.
Yes, yeah. She was a woman of means.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Hello. I thought you said last week that the Muslims gave the Jews three choices: convert or leave, but they couldn't stay. And then the Christians said convert or die. This week, you said that the Christians said convert or leave.
Yeah, so I am contrasting the Crusades, the time when they were passing through countries and in their progress from one country to another, they imposed this choice on people versus when an entire country was given a choice. And that happened uniquely in the Iberian Peninsula, in Spain and Portugal. And there, indeed, you are right to pick me up on that. They were given these two choices, not the standard two that happened during the time of the Crusades.
There's a question in the chat relating to you.
From
Martin.
last week about Maimonides.
Yeah,
Martin. Right, Martin Gilbert said that Maimonides converted to Islam is that generally considered to be true. Interestingly, I actually helped Sir Martin Gilbert when he was writing that book in Ishmael's house, and we discussed Maimonides. It is possible that he was in the Atlas Mountains while in Morocco, and that he converted to Islam following his own halachic ruling that one may do so temporarily to save one's life. And it could also be that in his particular case, he was worried about getting denounced for being the author of that letter that we mentioned last week. So it is possible. It's not absolutely certain one way or the other, but it is entirely possible that indeed he converted to Islam while living in Morocco, probably about 1163, something like that. It is possible.
thank you for that. Thank you.
Pleasure. Any other questions? No, have I stunned you all into a stupor from which you need to be awoken?
Can I ask a second question?
Yes, why not? Go for it.
Why not? Has any film been made of Dona Gracia, even a simplistic documentary film about her?
So they are supposed to be. They're supposed to be in production of a film in the last few years. And apparently there will be one coming out soon-ish. So I'm given to understand.
It's a good suggestion to make to Netflix.
Oh, I would want it to be a far broader production than that, unless they are such a rival to Hollywood that they would do it equal justice.
Shall we finish with a quick preview for next week, the third in the series?
Yes, so a little teaser. So yes, this one will be fascinating. I mean, we will be talking about two people, both who lived during the American wars against the British in 1776, both strong loyalty to the Americans, to the emerging 13 colonies, and are pretty much, once again, unknown to many. There are some very interesting episodes in the life of both, chiefly the first American Jewish spy, much more so than the first American Jewish rabbi. I mean, who wants to hear about rabbis anyway? But we will be mentioning both, and we will contrast this with some loyalists who were faithful to the British Jews who were living in America at the time. And so hopefully it will be a journey of discovery of the late 18th century about personalities who are pretty much unknown, but who achieved quite something during their lifetimes.
What a great trailer.
Rabbi, can I just go back to Dona Gracia with a question? Can you just clarify what happened to her daughter?
So her daughter got married, as I said, to her nephew. Unfortunately, they never had any children. and therefore the line dies out there. It's a tragedy in its own right. But she was, like her mother, a supporter of so many Jewish causes and of so many Jewish endeavors. Unfortunately, they never lived to see a next generation.
So what happened to the inheritance? Did she leave?
So it's interesting. The son-in-law became the Duke of Naxos. He was an admiral in the Sultan of Turkey's fleet. Also a very interesting individual in his own right. We know less about him. But it would appear that it was distributed within the Jewish communities after they died or towards the end of their lives.
So at least it didn't go to the church.
No, no, no. By then they were firmly in the Turkish Empire, and Salonika, her synagogue, stood for many centuries, I believe, but I'm not absolutely sure, until there was an earthquake in Salonika in 1911 or 1912, I think it was, and a number of synagogues were destroyed then. I think included in that was hers. No, there was definitely for centuries afterwards, the name would have been known.
Thank you. It was really interesting. Thank you.
Pleasure. Last question. I'll take this from the text. Did Maimonides marry when in Fez? And did he have any children? Thus families called Maimon and Maimon might be. So he married while he was, let's work this through a second. He married while he was in Morocco, yes. He definitely had children and grandchildren, and there are people I know who trace their lineage directly to Maimonides. And yes, those surnames and those names could very much be traced back to the Rambam. And yes, I did say Naxos, the Duke of Naxos, as the son-in-law of Dona Gracia.
And that's Sicily.
Yes, he was given the island at one stage.
Really?
He owned it.
Oh, really?
Rabbi Hirsch, did she ever remarry, or did she ever consider remarrying? Was she, after this long gap, having lost her husband?
We don't know. We don't know. Interesting question, but we don't know. You know, the record is blank on that. You know, it would appear that, you know, with her traveling from one place to another, it would have been perhaps more difficult to, you know, to settle down or to find somebody who would be mad enough to share her adventure. So, you know, that would have accounted for it, possibly.
Thank you.
Okay, I will leave it there.
Indeed, and thank you very much for a fascinating session. I'm sure we all learned a great deal, and a number of unexpected facts. In particular, since she was born in 1510, I didn't expect the Spanish Inquisition to figure. So thank you very much.
No one expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Absolutely, yes.
Not the comfy chair.
And the last word goes to Andrew there. Okay. Good night, folks.